So it is time to do an Old Testament book around here. And, we kind of like to alternate between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And at the high school that I teach at, they are letting me teach a spiritual formation class this year. So I don't get to create the curriculum or anything, but I do get to teach the Bible. So that's very cool. And we started the year in the book of Daniel, and we've been kind of running through the prophets in and around the Babylonian captivity. And now we're in Zechariah at school, which is the 11th of the 12 minor prophets. And Zechariah is right about the time that the temple is finished being rebuilt after the Babylonian exile. And the curriculum at school is going to continue with books that are kind of set in that time period. So we're going to be doing Esther soon at school, which we recently studied here at church. And shortly after that, we're going to be in Nehemiah. So since it's time to do an Old Testament book around here anyway, it seems like an opportune time for me to brush up on Nehemiah. And, Nehemiah is a book that's just remarkable in its ability to be applied to our lives today. And it's a very cool study, and so I'm looking forward to sharing this stuff. And so today we're going to do a version of an introduction to Nehemiah. So we'll actually not get into Nehemiah today, but we will set the stage for it. So this book is all about spiritual renewal for the people of God, and that would be a very cool thing for us to work towards and to actively seek in our lives and in our community. And so if you look at the history of Israel, their relationship with God kind of ebbs and flows. They have these incredible peaks of intimacy with God where they're following him around, sometimes as a pillar of a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And then they also have these incredible lows where they've completely lost their faith. All right, they've completely turned away from God, and they're worshiping rocks and stuff, they do the dumbest things. And their whole history is like this, with these spiritual peaks and valleys. And there might be something for us to think about there, because I think that mostly we see the same thing in our own spiritual lives, and we certainly see this in the history of the church. So we're often very hard on Israel for how stupid they could be, I think, and how blind and how forgetful. But I think that we're a lot more like Israel than we like to admit. We have these peaks of spiritual zeal in our lives, and we also have these times where we really don't even remember that there is a God. And just like the nation of Israel, it's often that turning away from God that we do that ushers in a lot of our crappy circumstances. And for the nation of Israel, at the time of Nehemiah, their nation has been destroyed. And their nobles have been hauled off to be captives in the Babylonian Empire. And then the Persian Empire comes in and takes over the Babylonian Empire. And so the people of Israel have experienced between 70 and 140 years of being immersed in these heathen cultures, even though God has promised them that they would be their own nation. And, there are similarities for us. There are times when you look at your life and you have trouble figuring out just where God and his promises are. I mean, maybe you thought you had something going on with God. You had this relationship thing going on. But then all this bad stuff is happening. And you can't find God anywhere. What about the promises of God to me? Okay, what about that I will never leave you or forsake you stuff? You ever felt forsaken by God? Well, over the last few thousand years, many people have felt that way. You're not alone. And you can see that when you turn to places like Psalm 77. This is a psalm of Asa, and I think he expresses this thing pretty well, that a number of people have experienced with God. And this is very likely what a number of the Israelites were feeling during the time of the exile. So he writes here, "Will the Lord reject forever, and will he never be favorable again? Has his loving kindness ceased forever? Has his promise come to an end forever? Has God forgotten to be gracious, or has he in anger withdrawn his compassion?" Then I said, "It is my grief that the right hand of the Most High has changed. I shall remember the deeds of the Lord. Surely I will remember your wonders of old. I will meditate on all your work and muse on your deeds. Your way, O God, is holy. What God is great like our God? You are the God who works wonders. You have made known your strength among the peoples. You have by your power redeemed your people, the sons of Jacob and Joseph." And so, there's a pretty interesting, emotional transformation here in the middle of this song that he's writing. And so he starts out in this place that, you may be able to identify with. God, why are you so far from me? Have I sinned or something? So that you've withdrawn your love and your compassion. How can God be good and letting me go through what I'm going through now? And so then just like he expresses here in verse 8, have the promises that God has made to me come to an end forever? And then there's this shift in the heart of the author when he starts to reflect on the fact that God is the God that does not change. God is the God of history. And as I consider all that God has done in the past and all the different ways that God has worked and the faithfulness that God has had to his people, and even when they weren't faithful to him, then I realize that God is with me, and he is good, and he is sovereign. And even though I'm facing something that's hard and bleak and painful, I can still believe that God is going to come through. And so this author is able to do this because the author is very well informed on the history and the promises of God. Okay, so you have to have a big picture of how God has worked in human history. You need to have at least a vague outline of how the events in the Bible are put together and what order things happen in, or you can't understand what the Bible is trying to tell you about God. All right, when an event or a character comes up in the Bible, you have to have a picture in your head of where they are in the timeline in order to get a sense of what they know and what they don't. You need to be able to see what they can see so that you can understand the points that they make. And so having this picture will lead you into having more correct assumptions and increased understanding so that we can really understand the heart of the situation for the people of Israel in the, the various times and places that come up in the biblical narrative, like the time of Nehemiah. And so this is also necessary so that we can more reliably come to the right conclusions in how to apply the things that the Bible tells us to our lives. So what I'm going to do today is something that I do for myself each time that I start a new book of the Bible, but I'm going to share it with you this morning. And so we're going to build an entire background for the story of Nehemiah. And we're going to put this story into a proper historical and spiritual context so that we can experience it the way that it was written. All right, so I'm going to share the background research and all of the context building that I do for myself, and I'm going to make sure that you know the things that I know so that you can track with these stories on your own. And to start, we could go all the way back to creation. But for the sake of time and simplicity, we are just going to go back as far as the patriarchs. All right, so this picture is just a zoomed in version of the beginning of that timeline that was up in the last slide. And we're going to pick up with Abraham. in Genesis 12. And so we get this picture in the Bible where God calls Abraham away from his extended family and away from his country and away from everything that's familiar to him. And God just tells him basically to start walking in a certain direction and to trust God. And Abraham believes God and he trusts God, even though he doesn't have the benefit of any scriptures or the benefit of understanding all that God has done in the past. Abraham follows God. And because Abraham follows God, we see God making a contract with Abraham. And so today we call that the Abrahamic covenant. And we can read it in the first couple of verses of Genesis 12. And it is so important that we understand the impact of what's happening here. All right, a great deal of understanding the history of Israel comes from understanding the importance of this promise. Okay, God says, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great. And so you shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. All right, so that's a huge promise, this Abrahamic covenant, and it's essential for understanding what's going on in much of the Old Testament. All right, a lot of the Old Testament is viewed through the lens of trying to figure out if God is going to make good on this promise or how God is going to make good. And so it's clear that Abraham is only going to go on for so long. All right, he's someday going to die. But the covenant that God makes with Abraham extends to his descendants. And so as you look at the people of Israel, or the descendants of Abraham, it's often through this lens of the question, is God really blessing them? All right, is God making our name great? Is God blessing those who bless us? Is God cursing those who curse us? Or sometimes, are we even a nation? Okay. So, are all the families of the world being blessed through us? And the thing that those questions hinge on is the same thing that you and I wonder. Okay, can God be trusted? Is the God of the Bible going to come through? Is he really good? Or am I more interested in my good than God is? Okay, so the Bible follows God as he moves through history. Abraham has a son named Isaac, and Isaac has a son named Jacob, and Jacob wrestles with God, and he's given a new name, all right, Israel, he who strives with God. Okay, and this guy Israel has 12 sons, and they become the 12 tribes of Israel. And this map here is from well after the time of Jacob. This is when the geographical nation of Israel is divided by these 12 tribes. And I just may need to point out again that this nation is named he who strives or wrestles with God. Okay, that's a pretty important point for understanding the relationship that the people have with God. And now before they're a nation that they were promised that they would be, and in the promised land of Canaan, there's sort of an important point of history that can't be overlooked, right? There's another stop on our timeline. God provides for Jacob and his family by making Jacob's son Joseph a leader in the nation of Egypt. Okay, God saves this family from extinction in a famine by giving them a home in Egypt. But this turns into 400 years of slavery under the most powerful nation at the time. And so how does the story get from I will bless those that bless you and I will curse those who curse you and I will make you into a mighty nation to the descendants of Abraham being enslaved for 400 years to this pagan nation? All right, so can you imagine living during that time? What would you be thinking? Okay, where's God? This is not what he said was going to happen. But when God introduces himself all over the Old Testament, he often says that he's the God of your fathers. I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Joseph. And so if you're living during this 400-year period in Egypt and God were to introduce himself as the God of Abraham, wouldn't you be like, okay, so what about that Abrahamic covenant thing? Okay, we're supposed to be a nation, but we're like a nation of slaves. And the Jews were being brutally murdered in Egypt at the latter part of this period of slavery. The Hebrew people, Jacob and his family, had come to Egypt by invitation, okay, and by God's provision. And they had settled in the land of Goshen, which was like the good part of the land. And they had flourished, and they had multiplied. And then Exodus chapter 1 says that a new Pharaoh arose that didn't know Joseph. And so this guy looks out and he sees this giant Hebrew population as a threat to the nation of Israel. And so he had them enslaved. And before long, the Egyptians are killing every firstborn son of the Hebrews in an effort to control the population. So imagine that Pharaoh has just murdered your newborn son. And echoing in your memory is this promise: I will bless those that bless you, and I will curse those that curse you. Really? Right? I go to church, I pay taxes. What's with this dead kid stuff? All right, so this is a very challenging thing to try and understand. Where are the promises of God, and how do they relate to my life? Okay, but we also, we learn as we study the Bible that like long before the 400 years of slavery started, God had actually told Abraham himself that this part was coming. Okay, Genesis 15:13 says that God said to Abram, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that's not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years." Okay, so it doesn't really mean that God wanted this to happen, but it does mean that it fell under the sovereignty of God and that God would use it to accomplish his purposes. Okay, God knew, and he told the people that things were going to be very difficult. The people didn't usually seem to believe or understand that part of what God was saying, but it's clear that God knew it. And then Exodus 2 says that God does hear the cries of the people. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the sons of Israel, and God took notice of them. Okay, so the promises of God do not mean that God's people do not suffer. The promises of God mean that God will not disengage himself. All right? God will be involved. God remembers the promises that he makes. And when the people cry out, God hears their cry and he raises up a champion for them. Charlton Heston. Okay, so that movie may be too old for most of you to know what I'm talking about. It's Moses, right? Like God raises up Moses to challenge the greatest military power on earth. And all of a sudden, these promises start to make more sense. I will bless those that bless you. The Red Sea parts. The Hebrews march through. I will curse those that curse you. Locusts, frogs, blood in the water. There's this like perfect justice of the death of every firstborn son among the Egyptians, right? The promises of God are tangible. They're true all of a sudden. God sends a deliverer, and the people march out to create this nation that's been promised to their fathers. A holy nation of priests, they were supposed to be, in order to be an inspiration to the world and bring the light of God to the darkness. Moses climbs the mountain. God speaks to him, gives him the word of the Lord. And then we read that God says, "Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among the peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel." So this is still God's plan to the Jewish people, right? Like the Abrahamic covenant is still a thing. and they're going to be a nation of priests. And now that probably doesn't sound that good to you. Kind of seems weird to be a nation of people that all wear little white collars and chant or whatever. But that's not what it meant to these people. Okay, a priest is an intermediary. And God's plan is to reach the world, and he's going to use the descendants of Abraham as the go-between to get that done. Okay, that's God's plan for the nation of Israel. Moses comes down from the mountain, and the people are all excited, and they wonder if it's okay to say some prayers to some other gods sometimes. And they wonder what they're supposed to think about money. And where are they going to get food? And what about comfort? What about all the things that we worry about? And Moses is just like, I don't know. All God said was that he was going to make us into a nation of priests. And then they get to the land that God promised their forefathers, and they stand at the border and they send in some spies to see who's already there. And the spies come back, and most of them say that it's time to turn around and go back to Egypt. Okay? The people are too big, and their walls are too high. The Canaanites are going to squish us if we go in there. All right? There's no way that this ragtag bunch of slaves that have been trekking across the desert is going to be able to take these people. And God is like humming a song, right? Like, I will bless those that bless you. I will curse those that curse you. Didn't something happen a couple of months ago at the Red Sea? Right? Like, where's Pharaoh right now? What happened to the most powerful military on the planet? Are you really going to worry about the Canaanites? And the Hebrews are just like, yeah, we are. And so God kind of takes a deep breath, and he takes the Jews camping. Okay, so 40 years they spend in that desert, and they stay until that entire generation that had seen more of the working of God than any generation before or since, with the exception of the generation that saw Jesus, had all died away. All that they saw, and they still refused to believe. Right? They refused to believe the promises of God. They refused to follow God. They refused to do the only thing that was the only thing that Abraham had been willing to do. Okay, and so a new generation rises up that can claim the promises of God and believe what God has said. And as they camped out on the Sinai Peninsula, everybody lived in tents. Right? And God tells them to build a big tent right in the middle. That's going to be God's tent. It's called the tabernacle, right? So the tabernacle is this incredible symbol of God dwelling right among his people. This place would be a thing that people could see, and it would remind them that their God was not like the gods of other lands. The other gods were dead and mute and powerless, and this God dwells right in the middle of his people. Okay? We could spend days talking about the symbolism and the beauty and the meaning behind the tabernacle, but the heart of it is literally just that God lives and dwells among us. Okay? So Leviticus 26 says, I will walk among you and be your God, and you shall be my people. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, so that you would not be their slaves, and I broke the bars of your yoke and made you walk erect. I will bless those that bless you. I will curse those that curse you. Right? I'll make you into a mighty nation, and through you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So hundreds of years have passed since God said this to Abraham. But his descendants are hearing and seeing this same consistent message. God's a God who keeps his promises. And when Moses is about to die, he's been through some stuff at this point. He's seen some things. He knows what's up with these people. And he leaves the people this warning. He says, For I know that after my death you will act corruptly and turn from the way which I have commanded you. And evil will befall you in the latter days. For you will do that which is evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger with the work of your hands. So Moses is about to die, and the thing that he says to the children of the promise is that he knows, and God knows, that they're going to screw this up. Okay, they're going to interfere with what God is going to try to do, and God's going to discipline them for it. All right, but through it all, God is going to keep his promises. And so then the story enters the period of the Judges. Judges is like my favorite book in the Bible. Okay, and so if you've ever wondered if God can work through criminals and idiots and murderers and pirates, then you need to read the book of Judges. Okay, it's not how good you are that determines your usefulness to God. It's your availability to be used by God. Anyway, the book is very repetitive. You can't really read it without picking up the basic theme. It keeps coming back to this place where it says, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And, there's all this injustice in the land. And so God would raise up these leaders who could set things straight and remind the people of the promises of God and their heritage and God's plan to make them into a mighty nation. And so it reads like this in the book of Judges. It says, Then the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals, and they forsook the Lord and got the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods from among the gods of the people who were around them, and bowed themselves down to them. Thus they provoked the Lord to anger. And so all these highs and lows for the nation of Israel, it's just a picture of the same way that you and I live out our relationship with God. Okay, we reach these moments where God is so real and he is so good, and like the Red Sea has been parted in your life. And then the next thing that you know, we're all like bowed down to a cow made of gold. Okay, the things that we worship may look different than the things that they falsely worshipped in those days, but the meaning behind them is just the same. And they're absolutely just as stupid to God as bowing down to a golden calf was. All right, so the people have moved into the land, and we've gone through the time of the Judges, and the people decide that they want a king. All right, all the nations around them have kings, and the kings look so cool in their armor and stuff. And this thing that we have where we live right among our God, it's kind of cool, but we'd rather have a man for a king. And God's like, seriously? Okay, so he gives them exactly what they asked for. He gives them Saul. Dude is tall and handsome. He looks fantastic in his armor. Got a horse, all that stuff. All right, so, and our mental timeline at this point has to transition from the time of the Judges into the time of the monarchy over the united king of Israel. Okay, but this whole thing where the people pick their king, it really doesn't work out that well for Israel. And so God's going to let them keep having a king, but he's going to pick the kind of guy that it is this time. And so he finds a guy that he refers to as a man after his own heart, David, a shepherd boy. Okay, and actually David really is quite amazing. Okay, he's a warrior and a poet. He sings and dances and slaughters the people who oppose God. Okay, so the Bible says that he's ruddy and handsome. Someday I'm going to have to look up what ruddy means. I suppose it must be good. But David's also this huge sinner and a guy who rebels against God. But the thing that makes David a man after God's own heart is not that he's morally perfect. It's that he trusts in the Lord. Okay, time and time again, he puts himself into the hands of God, and he emerges victorious because he relies on the power of God. Okay, so this dynamic is like most clearly illustrated when David does this terrible thing where he steals the wife of his trusted friend and then gets her pregnant and then murders the guy. But when it comes to the moment where he's held accountable and he understands what he's done is wrong, he turns to God, and in all sincerity, he repents and he asks for God's forgiveness. And he acknowledges that he's completely unworthy. And he's really undone by the reality of his own wretchedness. And God responds by telling David that he loves him. Okay, he forgives him. But there are consequences. Okay, there are things that are, there are realities that are the result of David's actions that God's not going to protect him from. But David is still God's man. And God makes David a promise that we call the Davidic covenant. In 2 Samuel 7, God says, "Your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever. Your throne shall be established forever." And so if you were king, this would be a pretty good promise, okay, to get from God. David's dynasty will be for eternity. And, David's cool with that. This is all a man could want, right? One of David's descendants is going to rule forever. And the people of Israel appropriately went ahead and cataloged this as one of the promises of God. And they interpreted it to mean that they would be a nation forever. The dynasty of Davidic kings will extend into eternity. All right, they have nothing really to worry about now. The God of the Bible has promised them safety and security, they think. And so after the death of David, his Solomon rises up and he builds God this temple. Right, the tabernacle was cool while they were wandering around the desert, but now they're in the city of Jerusalem, and so they build this incredible structure to be the house of God. And every Jew in Jerusalem and every Jew in all the Middle East could go to the temple and see the living reality of the fact that the Abrahamic covenant has come to pass. Okay, the descendants of Abraham had a home and a nation and a God that dwelled among them. And so this is like the golden age of the spiritual vitality of the people that wrestle with God. Okay, they're a united kingdom with nothing to fear, but it doesn't last. Not long after Solomon dies, the kingdom actually splits in half. Okay, the northern half keeps the name Israel, and the southern kingdom takes on the tribe name of Judah for the name of its nation. And so our timeline moves from monarchy into the time of the divided kingdom. Okay, they just couldn't agree on who should be in charge. And they fought with one another, and they fought with their neighbors, and they moved away from God and began to worship the Baals, and they lived for money, and they lived for self. And the light of God to the world that was supposed to be the nation of Israel grew so dim that there seemed to be no way that they would ever again become a nation of God's own possession and a nation of priests. And the northern kingdom got really bad, and God sent prophets to warn them that if all this crap continues, then they would just cease to exist. God would allow them to be wiped out. And that is just what happened. All right, the Assyrian nation completely wiped out the northern kingdom of Israel. They obliterated the government, the national identity. All right, they hauled a bunch of them off. They intermarried with those that they took away and with those that they left behind to make sure that there wouldn't be any Jewish identity left. And the nation of Judah watched this happen and decided that maybe they should repent. And they do for about 70 years. And then, Babylon rises up and conquers Assyria. And the mad king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, is knocking on the doors of Jerusalem. And over a decade-long period, he lays siege to and destroys the city of Jerusalem. He hauls the nobles and the educated and the wealthy off in chains back to the hanging gardens of Babylon, where the plan is to brainwash these people and turn them into his servants so that he can rule over whatever's left of the Hebrew people under the Chaldean religion and the Babylonian way. And, Nebuchadnezzar has a very rich dream life that's chronicled in the book of Daniel. Kind of an interesting guy. But he's also the guy that burned Solomon's temple to the ground during the sacking of Jerusalem. And so the center of Jewish faith and the center of Jewish identity is gone. Okay, the city's leveled. Jerusalem is essentially no more. All the people are in exile. And so how do these promises of God fit into this deal we've got going on now? How's God going to keep these promises that he's made? I will bless those that bless you, and I will curse those that curse you. You will be a mighty nation. The line of David will be established forever. Everything's gone. Okay, how can the promises of God be true? Imagine you're Hebrew and you're living in this time. Where's God? Is he taking a nap? Right? Does he lack the power to come through on the things that he's promised? Maybe he's changed his mind. And it kind of seems like there aren't that many other options at this point. But in the time before and during the Israelites' exile in Babylon, God raises up the prophet Jeremiah to speak to the people in exile and let them know the heart of God's plan for them. And you can see here that God's perspective is a little bit different. It says in Jeremiah 29, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat their produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease, but seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare." Wait, what? Right? Nebuchadnezzar is a pagan despot. He's the kind of king that rules with absolute authority. If you don't do what Nebuchadnezzar wants, he has you pulled into little pieces, and he burns down your house with your family in it, and he takes the little pieces of you and he puts them in the burned down house. Okay? And God is saying here to be a blessing to that guy. All right? Pray for that city. The city that destroyed the temple of your ancestors. Yeah. Pray for that city. Go to that city and be a blessing. Work hard and produce and pray for your captors. Because it's God's plan for his people to be a light in the darkness. All right? And they weren't doing that. Okay, when they had their city with its walls, they had their little huddle of the people of God, and they were comfortable. And now God's got them living among the people that he wants to reach. And through an incredible set of circumstances in the book of Daniel, you see how hard God is trying to reach Nebuchadnezzar. All right, Daniel chapter 4 is written by Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, it's a story where, the mad king of Babylon describes how the God of Israel broke his pride and he became a man of faith in God. "For thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, do not let your prophets and your diviners who are among you deceive you, and do not listen to the dreams that they dream, for it is a lie that they are prophesying to you in my name. I did not send them, declares the Lord. Thus says the Lord, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will visit you, and I will fulfill to you my promise and bring you back to this place." So all these guys that are telling you to rise up against your captors are not from God. Don't listen to them. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. Then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will hear you. You will seek me and find me when you search for me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and I will restore your fortunes and gather you from all the nations and all the places where I have driven you, declares the Lord. And I will bring you back to the place from which I sent you into exile. You will be a mighty nation. Okay, you will be a people of mine own possession. So how hard would that be to believe as you look out at the ruins of the city of Jerusalem and the burned out temple, and as you count the dead among the descendants of Abraham? All right, you're in the middle of weeping over your personal and corporate losses, and here again, God is claiming that he's a God that keeps his promises. All right, do you believe him? But, 70 years later, it's Babylon that's destroyed. Cyrus the Great of Persia takes over everything that used to be Babylon. So now Cyrus is the most powerful man in the world, and the 70 years that God had allotted for the Jewish exile is up. And so we enter into the period of the books of Ezra and Zechariah and Haggai and Nehemiah, which I promise we'll get to eventually. And in Ezra 1, we read, Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he sent a proclamation throughout all his nation, and also put it in writing, saying, Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among you of all his people, may his God be with him. Let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who's in Jerusalem. Every survivor at whatever place he may live, let the men of that place support him with silver and gold, with goods and cattle, and together with a freewill offering for the house of God, which is in Jerusalem. Then the heads of fathers' households of Judah and Benjamin and the priests of the Levites arose, even everyone whose spirit God had stirred to go up and rebuild the house of the Lord, which is in Jerusalem. All those about them encouraged them with articles of silver, with gold, with goods, with cattle, and with valuables, aside from all that was given as a freewill offering. So the nation of Israel, which has been spread out throughout all of Babylon and now Persia, hears this decree from the new king, and they're thrilled, right? They're excited. They all start putting their money together, and they're getting financial support from the people around them. This is going to be great, right? Even Cyrus is helping. Okay, he goes into the Persian coffers, and he digs through the temples to foreign gods. And also King Cyrus brought out the articles of the house of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem, and he put them in the house of his gods. And Cyrus, king of Persia, had them brought out by the hand of Mithredath, the treasurer, and he counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. So it looks like this is really going to happen. Okay, God's got the right person in place on the throne. The money and resources are there. Everyone's all excited. Nation has gone through their deepest low and into this extraordinary high. But, things often tend to not work out the way that we think they will. And it turns out that the people of God, this return to the promises of God, would be a slow and painful process. All right, it takes multiple generations. They wouldn't go back in a mighty roar by the hundreds of thousands to rebuild their city and their nation and their temple to the one true God. They would kind of trickle back to the land. That initial excitement and that initial push is met with some opposition. All right, we're talking about the hearts of people here. And you know what I'm talking about. There are surges, and there are moments when you would do anything for the Lord. But then, like, a butterfly floats by, or you see something shiny. Okay, and it's the same way with them. right? They were all excited to do this thing for God, and a few of them go back to Jerusalem. But when they get there, there are people that were already there. The Samaritans were there. The Samaritans were the descendants of the northern nation of Israel that the Assyrians had intermarried with. Okay, and they had wound up with a sort of bastardized religion and culture that the Jewish people were very hostile towards. And while the Samaritans had originally offered to help with the rebuilding, when the Israelites refused their help, the Samaritans decided that they don't want the Jewish temple rebuilt. All right, and so there's fighting and there are problems, and so not all of the remaining Jews are terribly interested in going back. There's some political opposition from back in the Persian capital. And so the Jews start the process of rebuilding, and then they stop the process. And eventually, the book of Haggai tells us that all the people that went back to Jerusalem were really just building nice homes for themselves. Okay, the temple of the Lord is left unfinished. And God has to raise up new leaders that are going to help the people push through this spiritual opposition of this situation that they're in. And if there is going to be spiritual renewal in the people of God, then there has to be leaders, all right? There has to be people that are willing to stand, and not just one or two people, but like a community of people that are willing to rise up from within the ranks of the very people that are called to lead. There has to be imperfect people who are willing to stand up, like warts and all, and say that they're not better than anyone else, but they are determined to see this through to the end. Okay, they're going to hold fast to the promises of God and the spiritual reality of who He is. And the people of God need guidance. They need examples, not just one guy or even like a small team of people, but like a movement of people that take seriously the promises of God and the call of God and the sovereignty of God. Okay, God's promises are true. And if we entrust ourselves to Him, then we're going to see the potential of God fulfilled in our lifetime. And finally, we get to the book of Nehemiah. All right, so from Nehemiah's point in time, it's probably been another 70 years since Cyrus first allowed the Jews to go back to Jerusalem. Okay, and the return itself has been pathetic. Okay, there's infighting, there's no wall around the city, it's open to attack of even minor enemies. The temple's still kind of junk. Okay, and Nehemiah is devastated by the fact that the call of God to return to the promises of God has gone out to the people, and the call is essentially ignored. Okay, Nehemiah is dwelling in the city of Babylon at this time, and he's wondering how this could be made to actually happen. Who could be powerful enough? Who could be persuasive enough to unite this nation that's been through all this horrible stuff and is in this terribly low place in its history to come together and be there to see the promises of God fulfilled? And it must have seemed to Nehemiah in his time very much like the spiritual relevance of Israel was in its past. Okay, they do kind of exist as a nation again. There's the start of a temple and a city, but it sure isn't much like the days of Solomon. And it probably seemed impossible to even hope that that would ever be the case again. It probably seemed like enough to hope for that they would just exist again for a little while. But the problem is that at this point in history, the promises that God has made to Israel have only been partly fulfilled. Okay, they have been a mighty nation. God did do some blessing of those that bless them and cursing of those that curse them. But the Davidic line of kings is supposed to rule forever. And the nation of Israel is supposed to become some kind of blessing to all the families on the earth. And we haven't seen that stuff yet at the time of Nehemiah. In fact, from our position in history, we can say that Israel has not even yet fulfilled its most important role in God's plan for humanity. The ultimate glory of the people of God and the descendants of Abraham, the most important spiritual work that God would ever do through them, is still hundreds of years in the future for them. Okay, that part about all the families of the earth will be blessed through the nation of Israel just isn't true yet. Okay, so there has to be a spiritual renewal among God's people. Honestly, if you look at the nation of Israel at this point in their history and imagine where they are in their timeline and try to draw an analogy to a human lifetime, Israel's like a middle-aged man. Okay, they're in the same place here that I'm at in my life. Okay, there was a really spiritually exciting time in my life. But now there are other things going on, and I'm kind of tired. Okay, I have responsibilities on more than one front, stuff like that. The highs and lows get harder to manage and to be okay with as you get into that middle age. And just like Israel's walk with God, ebbs and flows, our spiritual zeal and commitment tends to ebb and flow. You know, I've been at this thing for a while now. I've been a Christian for most of my life, and I've been trying to seriously walk with God for a reasonable percentage of it now. Okay, but I can remember the realization that the Bible's actually relevant to today's life, and that it actually has something real to say about the human condition and my life. The Bible really answers the deep questions that we wonder in our hearts. All right, there are those things in the Bible like Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53 and the festival calendar. And so do you remember the first time that someone laid out those prophecies and you were just like dumbfounded? How come everybody doesn't know this stuff? Okay, so we're not perfect here. In fact, we're kind of a mess. But we can love each other. And we do have some community. And we do have some discipleship. And we do try to teach people about the supernatural nature of the scriptures. And the object of the game for us really is to help God change the world. And when you're new to any of this, and these things are all fresh, it's all very exciting. Okay, and so that's just what it was like for Israel in the beginning of the reconstruction of Jerusalem. And when we start a thing and we're excited about it, we're willing to make sacrifices and we're willing to suffer because we're convinced that it's true. But just like Israel, the Jerusalem of our hearts gets captured by foreign nations and we bow down to their gods. All right, we bow to the God of comfort, the God of Monday Night Football. We bow to the God of mammon and money and 401ks and a nicer and bigger house. We don't actually reject God, but the zeal that we had in our original vision of our Christian life begins to seem like it was just the foolish zeal of youth. Okay, we kind of know that we will not fulfill the promises of God in our life, so we just sort of coast through the spiritual portions of life, pretty content to just keep going on like we are. We don't reject God, but we fall squarely into spiritual mediocrity. And we sometimes will kind of pine for the days of our spiritual youth. We wish that we didn't know now what we didn't know then. That early time was great, but now we know that it would just be totally irresponsible of us to actually live radically for God now. But the honest truth is, I believe this for myself, and I believe it for you, and I believe it for this community, that as long as our lungs draw breath, our best for God is still in our future. Okay? Just like the middle-aged Israel or a middle-aged Moses. Okay? As long as we're alive, God can use us. And when you're a brand new Christian, you're all zealous, you're willing to do whatever, you were also ill-equipped and immature and stupid. All right? But guess what's happened in the last 25 years since then for me and for you? Right? I've suffered. I've been disappointed. I've dealt with pain. I've been humbled some. All right? I've gotten equipped and I've learned some things. And I've come to realize that, I may never feel that kind of excitement again for the things of God, but I'm a much better tool for him to use than I was when I was more excited. And frankly, I would much rather know that I can be used effectively than know that I am being energized. Okay, and when I'm in my 60s, in the not too distant future, I plan to look forward and know that there's more ahead that I can be even more effectively used by God for. So look at the people that God really uses in the Bible. God very often uses old men. Ever think about that? Right? How old was Moses when he was finally ready to be used by God? You know how old Abraham was before God bothered to even speak to him? Okay, we need to be broken. We need the pride to seep out of us. And we need to be looking at our lives and wondering if this is all that there is. Okay, we need to let go of the excitement of our youth and let God mold that into our glory. The more you and I are broken and beaten down, the more God can use us. And when our expectations are lowered and we're living our spiritually mediocre lives, we are also the most equipped and the most honed spiritual workforce that are primed to be used by God. Okay, and the enemies of God know that. And so they're trying to keep you and I right where we are. Okay, they want us to keep believing that our glory days are in the past. And they're desperate to make sure that we do not believe that our spiritual future and our usefulness to God are at their brightest in the days to come. Okay, the things that God will use us the most for, our ability to be the tool that God can use the best, are still ahead of us. Just like it was for the nation of Israel in the days of Nehemiah. The people of Israel had no idea that God himself would come through the descendants of Abraham and be born in the person of Jesus Christ, a descendant of David, who would become a king that would die for the sins of all mankind, but who had then to also rule eternally. And every promise of God from Adam and Eve to the present day has been fulfilled. Okay, so Nehemiah is a roadmap for spiritual renewal. That's exactly why we're getting into it. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up with a couple of things that we need to make sure we understand. The God of the Bible is the God of history. And by that I mean that God has not changed. From the garden all the way to today, God has been doing the same thing with the people that he created from the very beginning. Okay, he's been teaching and guiding and moving and calling us to be used by him to be a light in the midst of darkness. That's God's chosen path for who we are. And God hasn't changed that at all. And God has made some promises along the way, and those promises apply to you and I, not just the people of the ancient past. All right, God's been working diligently and consistently from the beginning to draw all men to himself because he loves us. All right, God loves you, and he wants to use you to introduce himself to others. That dream of a nation and of a kingdom of priests is still very much alive. But now we call them ambassadors for Christ or Christians. God wants to use each and every one of us in that way. And if you're here right now and if you've never received the blessing that God promised through Abraham, then I'm going to put a point on it right now for you. Okay, the way that all the nations and the families of the earth would be blessed is that God would be born as a descendant of Abraham in the person of Jesus. And he would live a life that would teach us the nature of who God is. So we just finished the book of Hebrews, and we saw where it tells us that Jesus is the radiance of God's glory. He is the exact representation of God's being. Okay, we have a lot of ways that God has revealed himself through the prophets and the scripture, but the very purest form of understanding who your maker is found in studying the life of Jesus Christ. Okay, look at the way that he lived and loved and served. Okay, look at the way that he was falsely accused and beaten and hung naked on a cross to be crucified. Look at the way that he calls out, "It's finished," when God takes all the wrath that we deserve and he pours it onto himself in the person of Jesus so that you and I can be saved. Jesus made that possible. Okay, Jesus made it possible for each and every one of us to be forgiven. And that is how every family on earth has been blessed. But there's an act of your will involved. Right? There's an element of choice. So just like Israel had to choose to follow God's path in order to participate in that plan, we have to choose to receive God's forgiveness. We can't earn it. We can't force our way in. We cannot be so good that God is just like, dude, I don't really have any choice. You get to go to heaven. You're awesome. Okay, we can only turn to God in faith and admit that we're broken and that we need him in our life and that we need forgiveness. Please let the death of Jesus apply to me. Okay, then you get to start on a new road, start in a new place, and you get a new identity as a child of God. And to the children of God, there have been many promises that God has made. We need to recognize that the spiritual life is a marathon, not a sprint. It's something that you've committed to for the long haul. We're going to have highs and lows. There's going to be joy and love and warmth, and there's going to be pain, and there's going to be disappointment, and there's going to be death. Okay, but every Christian that you've met, that you respect spiritually, because they've stuck with it, and the old preachers and the old missionaries that talk like they're telling war stories, okay, those guys get gristly. And they get rock solid because they've been through it. Okay, when they talk about Jesus, they're talking about someone that they know is there in the good times and the bad. And you know what every one of those old badass Christians has in common? They didn't quit. Okay, they didn't settle. When they had times that were low, they turned to God and they repented. And they underwent this process of spiritual renewal that we're going to be discussing in this book of Nehemiah. Okay, they climbed up the mountain and they fell back down again, and they didn't stay at the bottom. They turned back to the mountain and they started climbing again. Okay, we need to be committed to discovering what the great future ways are that God wants to use us in other people's lives. God has a plan for your life, but it's not a plan for your holiness. Okay, it's a plan for your usefulness. Okay, we need to embrace that.